So like a flame, straight and unstirred, burn up thy being in one word. Next, still that ecstasy. Prolong thy meditation, steep and strong, slaying even God, should he distract thy attention from the chosen act. And so on. I mean, interesting stuff and rather beautiful. And I should also add at this point, if it's not clear, that that poem is about the chakras, how the sage has to work up through the 7 chakras of the esoteric body. And Crowley also travelled in India, and as a mountain climber, he also climbed some of the greatest mountains of the Himalayas. So he practiced will, and he also practiced yoga. He had teachers of yoga in India, so he'd actually studied this stuff in great detail. He was not a sort of a buffoon, pantomime character. And his poems and his writing comes out of a lot of deep thought. Also, he'd studied Buddhism in great detail. So that line where he says, make your meditation steep and analyze each thought that springs, every atom of thought subjected to analysis. That's quite Buddhistic. So he had a strong Buddhistic streak, and in fact, the Buddhist Society was set up around this time by Christmas Humphreys, and Crowley was close friends with one of the leading Buddhists who was involved with that. And it's interesting, the very opening of the Book of Magic is as follows: existence, as we know it, is full of sorrow. To mention only one minor point, every man is a condemned criminal, only he does not know the date of the execution. This is unpleasant for every man. Consequently, every man does everything possible to postpone the date, and would sacrifice anything that he has if he could reverse the sentence. Practically all religions and all philosophies have started thus crudely, by promising their adherents some such reward as immortality. And then he goes into a sort of history of which religions did what. Yes. Buddha was born a prince and died a beggar. Muhammad was born a beggar and died a prince. Christ remained obscure until many years after his death. Elaborate lives of each of these, and they've all been written by devotees, and there's one thing common to all those three: an omission. We hear nothing of Christ between the ages of 12 and 30. Muhammad disappeared into a cave. Buddha left his palace and went for a long time while into the desert. Each of them, perfectly silent up to the time of the disappearance, came back and immediately began to preach a new law. This is so curious that it leaves us to inquire whether the histories of other great teachers contradict or confirm. Moses led a quiet life until his slaying of the Egyptian. He then flees into the land of Midian, and we hear nothing of what he did there. Yet immediately on his return, he turns the whole place upside down. Later on, too, he absents himself on Mount Sinai for a few days, and comes back with the tables of the law in his hand. And so on. He discusses St. Paul and Buddha. And so I think the thing about magic and why it's worth reading is that, as I say, he was a Cambridge University graduate, an intellectual, which is quite uncommon among occultists. Often they just do magic and don't quite know what they're doing. What's interesting about Crowley is he was both an intellectual and a practitioner. And Then there's the business of World War II. Now this is quite interesting. In his biographies, I've got several of the biographies, it seems to be the case that during World War II, when Britain was down on its luck and being bombed by the Germans, and Germany had conquered pretty much the whole of Europe and were trying to defeat Britain, Winston Churchill got in touch with Crowley because Churchill was himself a Freemason and was aware of Hitler's interest in the occult, and the Germans were certainly using occult powers for their war and their victory. They were of a particularly dark sort of occultish thing. Aryan racism was their thing, and they hated Jews, they hated Freemasons, and they hated liberalism. Now all those, I think Crowley was pro-liberalism, all these sort of on the conservative end of that. He wasn't against Jews. In fact, a lot of his study is based on the Kabbalah. The workings of the Golden Dawn was all pretty much Kabbalistic. So Crowley was very aware of the wisdom and profundity of the Jewish contributions to magic, and he talks about Solomon and all the other great magicians of the Jewish tradition with great respect. And he wasn't a sort of narrow-minded racist who believed in Aryan perfectionism. You've got to be blonde, blue-eyed, and all the rest of it to get into the kingdom of God. I mean, he wasn't that stupid. He was himself of a dark hair colour, and he went prematurely bald, so he didn't have a lot of hair, and he had big starey eyes. So he was more on the, let's call it the Egyptian wing of the occult, and the Egyptians were Semites. So he was the reborn incarnation of an Egyptian priest. So he's a Semitic magician of an Egyptian variety. He didn't know enough about. I mean, the latest research shows that Moses was very influenced by Egyptian theology, and the Yahweh worship he brought out of Egypt was probably from Yah, the moon god of Egypt. Now, this was all discovered since Crowley. I mean, if he was alive now, he'd be absolutely in seventh heaven because of the internet. He could look up everything. He'd be writing 100 books on magic, I'm sure. But anyway, the point is, cut a long story short, Churchill consulted him and said, look, is there anything you can do to stop this Hitler guy? Because he's causing trouble, and he's an advanced occultist, and he's surrounded by these black magicians. Can you do anything? And by legend, by tradition, and again, historians of the occult have gone into this, and I think verified there's some substance to all this. Crowley did some counter magic to block Hitler. Exactly what? I can refer people to studies on that. But he realised that Hitler had gone too far and had gone absolutely bonkers. How much was known in Churchill's inner circle about, Auschwitz and the Holocaust against the Jews? I mean, things were known in British Secret Service circles. And I think Crowley was on the side of the British and the kind of anti-Hitler war. So he used his esoteric knowledge at that time, and I think that was inevitably necessary. And I suspect it was of a defensive kind. There are some other complicating issues. I'm not sure that everybody that called themselves a Thelemite was as intelligent as he was, or as able to think things through. There was a chap who was a journalist in Moscow, and who was close to Stalin, who had known Crowley at Cambridge, been influenced by him. And this fool, I can't remember his name now, was publishing articles in the New York Times, he's an American, saying, oh, Stalin, good bloke, don't believe all the stuff you read about, these terrors that he's doing. No, it's all propaganda. Well, it wasn't propaganda, but this guy had sort of screwed himself into thinking that, yes, Stalin was on the side of the goodies. Whereas anyone with a discernment could have worked out that Stalin was almost as bad as Hitler, and indeed, had had you weighed up their account book in history and stopped it at 1939, had a great angel come down, stopped World War II starting, and plucked out Stalin and Hitler from history and said, no, we're not having them on this planet, which is what I would have done. I think Stalin had done worse, more bad things by 1939 than Hitler had ever dreamed of, because Hitler had never actually at that point done very much, you know. I mean, yes, he'd created concentration camps, he'd put people in, but he hadn't started any kind of holocausts or mass slaughters or anything, whereas Stalin had already killed millions of his fellow Russians in gulags. And he'd also done the Holodomor against the Ukrainian people. So he was steeped in blood by the time World War II broke out. But anyway, this so-called Thelemite in Moscow was producing propaganda on the side of Stalin. And a book has recently been published claiming that that guy was a friend of Wittgenstein, the philosopher in Cambridge, who was secretly recruited to the KGB. You know, and it seems to be the case that Wittgenstein might well have been what they call the fifth man. There was a circle of Stalinist spies in Cambridge, very undercover, and it's possible that Wittgenstein was part of them, which explains why I had an antipathetic reaction to Wittgenstein when I was studying philosophy at university. I always felt there's something dodgy about this guy, he's not telling the truth. He was always trying to limit the scope of philosophy to a very narrow field. He would probably burn my periodic table if he could get hold of it, because he wanted to limit it to basically a materialist worldview. In Wittgenstein's worldview, there's only science, there's only matter, and the job of philosophy is to kind of commit suicide, because all philosophical speculation outside of material science is false. Well, that's the Stalinist line. That was the line of dialectical materialism. So, and I don't agree with it, but I'm just saying, you know, there's still research to be done. Let me just put it like this: there's still research to be done on the influence of the Thelemites in history. Crowley himself lived on to be a slightly older man, dying in Sussex in 1947, in Hastings. You know, he wasn't particularly well known. Only in certain circles was he. I mean, he was never famous. But anyway, I think an interesting man, and Thelemite tradition. There've been some interesting characters involved with it in its more intellectual wing. Let me just finish by quoting his comments on religion. He said, Crowley, there are to be no regular temples of Nuit and Hadit, for they are incommensurables and absolute. Our religion, therefore, for the people, is the cult of the sun, who is our particular star of the body of Nuit. And now Nuit, in quotation marks, is the goddess of the starry sky. We've got her up there at the moment. And he, as an Egyptian, he loved Nuit, who was a goddess, from whom, in the strictest scientific sense, comes this earth, a chilled spark of him, and all our light and life. His vice-regent and representative in the animal kingdom is his cognate symbol, the phallus, representing love and liberty, Ra Hur Kuit. Like all true gods, is therefore a solar phallic deity. All those acts which excite the divine in man are proper to the rite of invocation. Religion, as understood by the vile Puritans, is the very opposite of this. It seems to wish to kill its soul by forbidding every expression of it, and every practice which might awaken to its expression. To hell with this verbotenism. In particular, let me exhort all men and all women, for they are stars. Heed well this holy verse. True religion is intoxication, in a sense. We are told elsewhere to intoxicate the innermost not the outermost. But I think the word wine should be taken in its widest sense as meaning that which brings out the soul. And so on. He also was among the pioneers who explored drugs. Crowley was someone that felt hashish was a sacred sacrament because it brought about a change of consciousness. Sorry. And so in the 60s, in the kind of 1960s, hippie times, Crowley became a sort of a cause célèbre. And the Beatles, when they brought out their records, put a picture of him on the cover of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, which was one of the iconic albums of the 60s. And because the 60s were about free love, exploring with drugs and searching for an alternative new religion, in a sense, a lot of people discovered Crowley at that time and thought, gosh, he was 40 years ahead of us in saying all this. And I met people who were studying him. I was influenced by him. And and also, he designed the most, I think, if he hadn't done all the other stuff, he designed a tarot deck, which is here. He got an artist to do the pictures in 1920s kind of style, and he designed them all. And it's a very beautiful tarot deck. This is the Hierophant. He wrote a book about it all. And when I first discovered his tarot deck at the age of 19, I found it very powerful. I wasn't born into a family that was interested in all this stuff. My mother was a Marxist, but I discovered it privately, growing up in Brighton, and I thought, wow, this is amazing. Why has nobody told me this in school? So I dropped out of school to become a poet. And of course, therefore, I thought this was pretty amazing. I had a girlfriend at the time, and I remember me and her consulting Crowley's tarot deck and getting some amazing results. And so, hats off to him for his interest in art and poetry. And later on, now, I've just published my own tarot deck, and I've, tried to update the ideas that Crowley was working with in my Tarot of the Gods, which is a unique new tarot deck. And maybe I'll show that at the beginning of the next session after we've had our little break. But anyway, so that's a little glimpse of. Now it's called a new religious movement by academic experts. Crowley himself would say, well, it's drawing together lots of old stuff. It's certainly not. It doesn't fit comfortably into one of the boxes. So I think that's why it deserves its own box. Thelema is box 107 of the new religious movements. And it's interesting. Worth studying, I think. Right, we'll stop there and have a little break.